So next up we've got Conor Twyford. I'm lucky enough to work alongside Conor at NZI Te Roa. Conor works, she's got a very unique role. I think it's the first role of its type. So Conor is essentially a community organiser for NZI. So, you know, we're thinking about our unions as also not just worker organisations, but they're part of communities, they're social movements. And she is looking specifically at her passion, which is how we implement our climate change strategy. So Conor's got a long history of working in community and union movement all of her working life, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. So welcome, Conor.
Can everybody hear me all right? Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngami nui kia koutou katoa. So the corner I'm coming from on this panel is as a long-standing active member of unions and community organisations. I've truly got one foot in each waka. And I'm not unique at all in that, but I'm very lucky to have this new role with NZI Te Roa. To be granted the privilege of working pretty much full-time with our members on climate and just transition issues is, I pinch myself every day, and I've been there 4 months now. I'm also a proud E2 member again, after a stint with the PSA. My first, just by way of my own union whakapapa, my first job was at Woolworths in 1980 as a checkout chick in Alice Springs, and I was, I joined the union because it was what you did. And I'm thinking about my 15-year-old twins. I'm thinking maybe I'll kick them out of the house if they don't join the union. That's a good strategy. I just want to honour the people on this panel, and all of you in this room, and all of our union whānau outside this room for the work that we do day in, day out to build a movement. And I want to tautoko Grace's speech earlier today as well. My previous job before this was as manager of Wellington Sexual Abuse Help, and I came up against my own anti-union board. After I'd resigned the position, they told me I had a conflict of interest for being in the collective agreement and showed a serious lack of judgment, so I thought, fuck you. I'm going to go you at your own AGM. Anyway, back to climate change, which is apparently easier than sexual violence as it affects working people. I thought, given this is a Labour history lecture, that I'd go back in time to see what Marx said about ecological breakdown. I was actually too young for study groups. I missed the Marxist period. So when I did my environmental science degree in the early 90s, I studiously avoided reading Capital, managed to scrape through with a C for an essay on what Marx thought about the environment. So still not in the mood to study Marx for this today. I reached out to our esteemed colleague Jim McAloon for help a couple of weeks ago. He could do far more justice, I thought, to Marx than I would do in the time I have, and I do want to cover other things, but here's a brief segue. So I proposed to Jim that Marx did not have a lot to say about ecological breakdown. As he noted, on one hand, you might say that's hardly surprising. When Marx was writing, it would have been hard to predict the scale of what we're now dealing with. However, Marx did write about the ecological consequences of capitalism, and famously, or perhaps not, because I'd never heard him, the history of nature, he said, the history of nature and the history of men are dependent on each other so long as men exist. Marx is probably best known for his concept of alienated labour under capitalism, yet for Marx the fundamental source of alienation was our estrangement from nature. This began with the enclosures, but Marx also talked about the loss of a way of life in which people found meaning in their connection to nature. He recognised that our connection with the land, with the whenua, had been broken under capitalism, the mode of production that now rules the planet is in fact destroying it. Marx's colleague Engels also wrote about the consequences of industrialisation, about pollution, especially waterways. In fact, both Marx and Engels understood the Earth's ecosystem as dynamic and complex, an intricate, delicate, balanced process of interacting components where any changes that occur feed back with new and often unpredictable effects. Our colleague Jim would go so far as to suggest that Marx's entire critique of capitalism was based on the imperative of an endless accumulation. And of course, Marx acknowledged that all production in the end rested on natural resources. So, bearing that in mind and flipping that around, if all production in the end rests on natural resources, and if we acknowledge that Marx and Engels both did in fact have something to say about ecological breakdown and ecological justice, then we can return to focusing on the issue of justice more broadly. Where I'm going with this is to say that today's ecological issues and the need for climate justice, for a just transition that meets the needs of working people, of our families and our whānau, are really the same issues we have always fought for in the union movement. And I've never stopped being emotional about this. And that Marx highlighted a long time ago. So unions. I'm more union now, having been a chief executive of an organisation that had an anti-union board than I ever was. So Lifewise is another example of a not-for-profit that has got an anti-union board. Unions were born out of the struggle for social justice in its many forms. We've campaigned for an end to racism, gender discrimination, ableism, and of course class oppression. Now that needs to include an end to climate injustice, because ecological breakdown affects everyone, but it affects marginalised groups most of all. Unions at our best, we're incredibly effective in organising and coalescing and working as allies around these issues. And there are lots of examples. We've got the Green Bands in Sydney and Auckland, with fabulous Jack Mundy, the New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation, 42 union bands on construction sites in the state. More recently, some unions, there have been notable and predictable divisions, have supported Indigenous activists' rights and fight against Keystone XL in the States, and various climate justice groups have sprung up in the States and around the world, often with the engagement of local unions, and I think we'll see increasingly more of this. We have climate justice Taranaki. We have Blackball. So does history provide the answers for how to address our current crises, and if so, what can it teach us? And may they drink your water. Thank you very much. So, first we can see that the original analysis still holds. This is long. Despite the fact that this climate emergency could not have been dreamt of in the 19th century, that much is true. And if we look at union history, then we can remember the constructive role that unions have often played in organising across movements with their relative abundance. So I lived half my life in the not-for-profit sector. Resources, stability, compared to so many other activist organisations. I'm thinking about Bastion Point, the Springbok Tour, and of course much more recently the Living Wage movement. All the union committees and the runangas that we're able to set up because we're solid and we're strong. All the things that Sibel talked about. So I grew up in Australia, so I missed the Springbok Tour. I came back in 1995 to volunteer for the Alliance Party because I saw something that looked like what I thought might be the solution. Red, green and brown working together. I was fortunate enough, so if you think about that, I missed the Springbok Tour. Fortunate enough to watch Patu a couple of months ago, and I thought, my goodness, what a masterclass in movement building and allyship that was. Powerful tactics were employed during the tour to progress the protests. Many activists, either from unions or were from unions or became union leaders, including some of my respected colleagues on this panel. That is a proud heritage, and in this room. Unions understand very well the power of community organising, of working together with allies on widely, deeply felt issues, ideally over the course of decades. Like all community movements, however, we're good at remembering our history and also at forgetting it. And new people come along and they don't have that history. We need to remember to continue to build across movements and not to become too insular. It is a constant struggle when the issues that we work with are often so all-consuming that we become siloed, fragmented, and sometimes not the best allies. We need to value and use the true and tried methods of organising. First rule, find your people, while at the same time also using the new tools available to us. And we need to continue to build enduring relationships with other movements, something the Living Wage movement has of course done so successfully. So, on to the second part of the question. Can history show us the way forward, or is it a trap? It can be a trap if we forget to remember that we are creating history every day that we do this work. Women have always played a hugely important role in unions, but all too often patriarchy rises up to bite us on the bum. Nearly scratched that out, but yeah. The Me Too movement it was a moment, and I hope that we continue to see people find their words, because that is a key moment in time. Gender binaries are dissolving around us, and all of us need to be respectful and cognizant of that. The disability movement is gathering steam, and there's important things to say about the contribution that people from diverse physical and neurological backgrounds, and I include myself in that, have to make. We are truly in an era where intersectional, intergenerational issues are rising up to confront and challenge us all, and we need to engage with that. In terms of the rise of Black Lives Matter and the revival of Indigenous sovereignty movements, and we think about Ihu Mātau, we think about Shelley Bay, there is a real challenge now across the globe to decolonise and re-indigenise, and that is going to challenge all of us with privilege. And I certainly include myself in that. If we go back further in time than Marx, in the Aotearoa context, back to 1840, and indeed 1835, then we have the founding documents of He Whakapūtanga o Te Rangatiratanga o New Tirene, the Declaration of Independence, followed 5 years later by Te Tiriti o Waitangi. While many unions have been particularly good at prioritising the needs and concerns of Māori and Pacifica, we need to ask ourselves whether we have done, and are we doing enough? Are we doing what is needed as a labour movement to address our own structures of power in terms of resourcing, decision making and addressing inequity, in terms of upholding our responsibilities as treaty partners? If we wind forward, and I've only got a little bit left, so don't cut me off, to much more recent times, we have the excellent work done by Dr. Moana Jackson, Professor Margaret Mutu and others via many hui held during the Mātiki Mai process, which looked at the need for constitutional transformation, not just reform. The terms of reference given to Mātiki Mai were to develop and implement a model for an inclusive constitution for Aotearoa based on tikanga and kawa, he whakapūtanga o te rangatiratanga o New Tirene of 1835, Te Tiriti o Waitangi of 1840, and other Indigenous human rights instruments which enjoy a wide degree of international recognition. To conclude, earlier this month, the Mātiki Mai Constitutional Convention was held. Dr. Jackson, who isn't very well, in his keynote stated that for Māori living in a colonised state, there is a need to continue to reclaim mana motuhaki and rangatiratanga. Dr. Jackson has spoken previously of the need to create structures and spaces that recognise Indigenous space, tauiwi space, and the relational space between. At all times in this process, we need to prioritise the needs of our First People. That is what I want to look at in my thesis this year. How can putting Māori and Pacifica first in everything that we do, how can looking at the world through the lens of Mātauranga Māori, which is an applied science which has its own empirical basis, provide the ways forward for addressing climate change? Because if we go down that road, by definition, we have to question everything. How we relate to nature, how we relate to each other, how we structure our working days, how decisions get made, how we work in allyship, where we start when we set out to build campaigns, and most importantly, how we give up power. Te Takanga o Te Wā, the Māori History Guidelines give us pointers as to how we can begin to think differently and act differently in relation to the planet. Core concepts underlying the guidelines are these 5 kupu: tūranga waiwai, whakapapa, whanaungatanga, kaitiakitanga, and mana motuhaki. Each of these require us to think outside our individualistic colonial box that got us in the shit in the first place, about such things as connection to the land and each other, responsibility for the whenua and to each other, to those who came before us and those coming ahead of us, ecological justice and Indigenous sovereignty. That's just my uneducated take. I don't think we've done this before to the degree we need to do it now, and what we do know is the old ways of thinking are not working, even with the most excellent histories and tools that we have. With climate change threatening life itself, the ecological contradictions of capitalism have reached truly dire proportions. The crisis will undoubtedly play a far larger role in the demise of the system than Marx and Engels were even capable of thinking. Right, to finish up, I have great hope. I look at the school strikers. I look at the rise of the Indigenous sovereignty movement yet again, and I see the way forward. And I look at the work unions are doing, and I think that's pretty profound. Our union, I'm really proud of our Moku Te Ao process. I think we're going to do some incredible work this year in terms of putting Māori first, putting Pacifica first. And I think about some of the things that we might need to do. Maybe we need to start a new kind of people's resource centre, but it's got a climate aspect. Maybe we need shorter working weeks. So, yes, history has so much to teach us, and the old tools and the analyses are incredibly powerful. And we need to take a new tack that builds on the excellent work the unions have already done and are doing, and then we need to take it to the next level. And above all, we need to be kind to each other, because gosh, we can be hard on each other on the left. Lorera, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.